Thank you to the NIH Office of Research on Women's Health for the opportunity to share this work with you all today, and to my wonderful co-authors who are listed at the top of your screen. I'm Ariel Becha, and I'm going to walk through our poster titled Advancing Understanding of Structural Sexism and Population Health Inequities, Introducing a Novel Modeling Approach to Capture Life Course and Intersectional Effects. And before I begin, I just want to note that this is an ongoing project, and so any and all feedback is more than welcome. And additionally, for the sake of the illustrative analyses I'll present here, we are using Dr. Patricia Homan's conceptualization of structural sexism as reflecting the systematic gender inequality in power and resources that is embedded within our social, political, and economic institutions. So to start, there is growing evidence to suggest that structural sexism is a key driver of gendered health inequities in the US. However, likely due to methodological challenges, very few studies have yet to consider life course or intersectional effects, or in other words, the ways by which structural sexism impacts health over time and differentially between and within gender groups. So we have been working on developing a novel analytic approach for structural sexism and population health research to help address these gaps. And to briefly summarize, we start by leveraging longitudinal indicators of US gender inequality. So for example, things like wage gaps and abortion bans, which we use to classify states as having higher or lower levels of structural sexism in a given year, and informed by relevant theoretical frameworks such as life course theory and ecosocial theory. We focus on cumulative exposure to structural sexism, which we define as the mean time someone spends living in a high structural sexism state during some relevant time period. Next, associations between this cumulative exposure and health outcomes are estimated using sequential conditional mean models. And these are a class of causal models that allowed us to address potential time-varying confounding that stems from the dynamic natures of states' broader sociopolitical climates. And to illustrate, we've applied this method to examine how cumulative exposure to US state-level structural sexism from late childhood through young adulthood contributes to inequities in depression in the Growing Up Today study, which is a large cohort of young people who we followed from 1996 to 2016. In our first set of models, we looked at the overall association between cumulative exposure and depression, and we compared the results that we got to those obtained from using a point-in-time exposure operationalization, so ignoring any long-term or life course effects. Then in a second set of models, we tested for differences by gender and among girls and women only, given some sample size issues. We also looked at differences by sexual orientation and race using stratification, and then in models that are not presented here, also using interaction terms. So then to move into a summary of our results, first, we found that a 1-unit increase in cumulative exposure to structural sexism from baseline through time t-1 was associated with a 15% increased risk of depression at time t. And conversely, estimates for the point-in-time exposure operationalization were not significant, suggesting that ignoring the duration of time spent exposed to structural sexism may result in an underestimation of effects. Second, our intersectional analyses revealed how structural sexism was only associated with depression risk for girls and women, with the strongest effects observed for those who are also sexual minorities. However, we do also want to highlight that the Growing Up Today study cohort is predominantly non-Hispanic white and middle to upper class, and several of the sexual minority and racial ethnic minority subgroups are quite small, and this necessitated the collapsing of these categories. So it will be very important to examine these relationships in more diverse and representative samples. So in conclusion, sequential conditional mean models represent a promising approach for examining how structural sexism shapes population health patterns over time and at the intersection of multiple social identities. And as I said, this work is ongoing, and we hope to further develop these models and apply them to better understand the drivers of gendered health inequities in our future work. Thank you so much for listening.